I think it's time for us to get back to work, except that makes it sound like it's a chore, but I think it's time for us to get back to something else that's going to be great, which is our second panel. And thanks for everybody again for being here and for participating in the conference. Welcome to all of our guests. And I have the very limited job of introducing Gary Gensler, and who is going to introduce the rest of the panel and chair it. And Gary doesn't need much of an introduction, but he'll get one anyway. He's a professor of the practice Global Economics and Management and professor of the practice in finance at MIT Sloan School of Management. Before then, he had not one, but several very successful careers as chair of the Securities and Exchange Commission, and then before that, Securities chair of the Commodities and Futures Trading Commission, and undersecretary and then assistant secretary of the Treasury. And that's after a very, very successful career at Goldman Sachs. So now, what's going to be fourth career? I don't know, but we'll see. But perhaps chairing this wonderful panel. Thanks, Gary.
Thank you. This mic's working. I'm going to just do it from the chair here. Thank you, Deron, David, and Simon for inviting me to do this. I just wanted, before we introduce this great panel, do a shout out for Jim Stone. No, really, Jim, that you set up this center with Deron, David, and Simon and collaborated with MIT. Jim and I, just as background, have known each other because he was the second Senate-confirmed chair of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. There was an acting chair, I think, in the middle there for Jimmy Carter. You look so young, Jim. But he really was this incredible public servant doing insurance commissioner work up here, and then later, you know, all this other successful work, and that you want to give back and make, you know, the economy work better and society work better. It's just a big applause to Jim, and it's good to reconnect with you after all these years. But I've got the duty of introducing this incredible panel and then try to get out of the way and then moderate a little bit. And you know, we're going to do it from in order of the speakers, not by the alphabetical order of the list here. But Wojciech, Kopczuk, at Columbia University is remarkable. All three of our panelists are remarkable in their focus to inequality, but a little bit different way that they came at it. I guess you were a computer science undergrad, but somehow, that brings you to near and dear to MIT, by the way. But somehow then looked at really as a professor of economics and international and public affairs at Columbia University, but through the lens of public finance. And a lot of his work about inequality is also through the lens of the tax code. So not a tax lawyer, I don't think, but through the lens and really how that's kind of distorted things. He's going to really focus on wealth inequality versus income inequality when he has some remarks here, and how pass-through taxation and other forms of taxation can kind of distort all of that. Ellora, I guess you're going to go second, yes, is with us from Princeton. Remarkable bit of work that she's worked on over the years around the Great Migration and what that's in the US when a lot of post-Civil War, the movement of Black America, African Americans up to the north, and what that sort of, for a better future in their lives, what that foretold, or did it? Or did it not? Did it have some sort of multi-generational thing that would still persist? And I think when reading some of your research about Deron's and Simon and Jim Robinson's work, about how things that happened hundreds of years ago can still persist. And that's what you've seen as well. And we'll get into that a little bit. And then Sasha is with us from Michigan, University of Michigan. It's a sociologist, so we really have, you know, is that all right?
Yes.
Did I say that? You know, three different disciplines and tell us about why wealth inequality matters. That's the core of this whole session here today. But really looking at generational wealth and how that's persisted over the time. I want to give a shout out to the earlier panel, by the way, and just answer one thing that was asked there. just saying, the top 10 US companies, this is because I do this sort of securities finance stuff, Liz has mentioned it. I don't know about the top 7, but the top 10 in a $70 trillion equity market in the US is about 30 trillion or 43% as of last week. That's it, 43% of the top 10. That gives you that sense of concentration. And another statistic is worldwide there's about 3,000 billionaires, of which about a third, or about 1,200, are US. So you were focused probably not on the billionaires, you were focused on the deca-billionaires, probably the top 100, 70 to 100. Or maybe you were actually focused on the top centabillionaires. But centimillionaires, there's 10,000 or 12,000 in the US, so you start to see that. But in any event, Wojciech, you want to?
All right, so I'm going to talk about, I have 7 minutes, so I'm not going to talk about taxation, and I'm going to talk very little about the very top of the distribution. But what I'm going to talk about is basically what type of inequality we are measuring and what it means and what should we be kind of, or why are we interested in it. And in particular, this is the session on wealth inequality, and I mean, this is not the only way of thinking about inequality. And it's not necessarily the easiest way of thinking about inequality. So why do we care about wealth inequality? I think there are 2 main reasons. So one is that it's potentially a metric for disparities. And that's kind of broadly speaking, that's not just about the very top, it's sort of just in general in the distribution. How wealth is distributed is potentially telling us something about disparities in the society. And another one is externalities. The fact that wealth is concentrated, or like various aspects of wealth distribution may have implications beyond just how they affect that particular person, but they have kind of societal impacts or impacts on other people. So I'm going to punt for the moment about externalities. Other panels were about externalities. So I think they are important, and we can come back to it in the discussion if there is a purpose. But I'm going to mostly talk about wealth as kind of metric for disparities. And wealth is a very complicated metric for disparities. So if I think about inequality and kind of how well off people are, like my first way of thinking about this is to think about what are their lifetime resources. However you define it, it could be like earnings over the lifetime. Probably includes transfers from their parents. So that's kind of something that describes the potential for your consumption and well-being over your lifetime. Now, wealth, as measured at any particular point in time, is not that. It's related, but it's really not that thing. Because at any particular point in time, you're not seeing all of the resources that people will have access in their lifetime. And because wealth is a decision. Wealth follows, to a large extent, from decisions about how much to save and how much to consume and when to save and when to consume. So it's kind of this complicated outcome of a lot of different things that's evolving, over the lifetime of a person and varies depending on like circumstances and the types of institutions and environment that you are dealing with. Another way of, and kind of complementary way of thinking about wealth is that wealth is delayed consumption. It's things that you haven't consumed yet, that you could consume in the future, maybe, or your children could consume in the future, depending on who we are talking about. So from that point of view, I mean, there's obviously that has value, but like people, putting aside externalities at the very top of the distribution, people who hold a lot of their wealth are not consuming that wealth. So if they are not benefiting from it in some other ways, they are actually foregoing something, or they are kind of have this like option value of consuming in the future. So from that point of view, it's actually not totally obvious that having a lot of wealth is such an amazing thing. And just to give you like one fact about this, which I find kind of it's sort of extreme, but I find it somewhat stimulating to think about, is like you can take two European countries, Greece and Germany. Germany has GDP per capita, income per capita, more than twice as high as Greek GDP per capita. The difference in the median wealth of a Greek and a German is about 20–30%. It's not a very big difference. Why is that? Well, it's primarily because Germans rent their houses. Their home ownership rate is 47%, and Greeks own their houses. Because the rental market is weak, credit markets are weak, so you actually have a lot of wealth that's tied up in real estate. In Europe, countries with the highest home ownership rates are countries like Romania and Bulgaria, not necessarily the richest countries in Europe. Is this a good thing that Greeks have a lot of wealth? It's sort of reflecting something about the nature of that economy that's not necessarily correlated with them being better off. It's sort of it's reflecting a problem in the economy. What are other reasons why people may hold a lot of wealth? Well, if the safety net is weak, if precautionary saving is important, if saving for health-related reasons is important, and so on. So all of those things sort of show up in wealth statistics. And in that environment, when these problems are real and serious, then you can think about wealth as sort of reflecting something about disparities. But you can also look at it and say that, like, what is the problem here? The problem is not necessarily wealth distribution. The problem is whatever leads to the need for tying a lot of your assets in that form rather than being able to consume. You can think about debt. Some of the people with very high debt are medical residents. They are not lifetime poor. They borrow early on because they expect to have higher level of income in the future. That's not an enormous group in the society, so this is not what's driving wealth distribution in the society, but it's kind of yet another type of a wrinkle that sort of, when you look at wealth distribution, it's kind of there. It's part of the life cycle. It's part of how wealth evolves over time with age for that particular group, with very particular shape of their lifetime income profile. So all of these things kind of make looking at wealth kind of complicated. I sort of care about like many of these reasons independently, and I think wealth inequality or wealth holdings, wealth accumulation patterns kind of reflect that. But they are like wealth is not like the right metric on its own to actually focus on each of those problems. Now, once we go to the very top of the distribution, it sort of becomes a bit clearer, especially if you are concerned about externalities from it, that maybe that's the focus of interest. But elsewhere in the distribution, it's just a proxy for various things, and a proxy that's not necessarily always correlated in the sort of right direction with disparities. It's a much more complex object. So I'm talking about this because I'm an economist and especially interested in measurement of these things, and these things show up in measurement and kind of make wealth inequality, changes in wealth, comparison across cohorts, age groups, kind of quite complex to interpret. One other aspect that I kind of briefly alluded to, but haven't really discussed yet, is inheritances. That kind of breaks a bit the logic of what I was talking about, in the sense that it is component of wealth. It is something that you can consume, or you can leave it to your children. But it sort of comes a little bit from outside. It comes from your parents. It comes from somebody else. So this kind of life cycle perspective, when a person kind of allocates resources over the lifetime, that's not exactly the right thing in the world where there is a lot of inheritances. And what that relates to, and I think is another word that economists sometimes use, is equality of opportunities, which to me is really the sort of primary reason to be interested in inequality. I'm care less about equality of or inequality of outcomes. I care more about having a leveled playing field and kind of having the types of institutions that lead to a leveled playing field. So inheritances are sort of a component of wealth that's particularly implicated in not having a leveled field if you are thinking about people as kind of individuals and not parts of families, which is kind of a tension that has been there throughout, and is a tension that sort of people have mentioned before, but makes it complicated to think about inheritances, state taxes. All right, so I guess I'm on time.
Ellora, there or here, wherever you're comfortable.
Oh, well, I feel like now a precedent has been established. So. Well, let's see if you can see me over this, though. Okay. No, I think it's better if I think you can see me better if I sit here. Great. So thanks so much for having me as part of the panel. I'm here to talk about racial wealth inequality and its evolution in the U.S. And why is that part of this panel? I think when we think about wealth differences, at least among economic indicators of gaps between Black and white Americans, wealth is by far the largest. And so it's going to come up in every conversation about wealth, these enormous racial wealth gaps. So we know from modern survey data that the racial wealth gap in the US, measured as the ratio of per capita white to per capita Black wealth, is around 6-to-1. And it's been that way for almost 50 years, so since the 1980s. And what that means is that the average Black American holds just about 17 cents for every dollar of white wealth. Now, you can actually, and this is what a team of collaborators and I have done, put together historical data to look at this gap further back in time. And you can do that using census data, using historical surveys, and actually tax reports, because it turns out US states used to levy taxes on wealth until the 1930s, general wealth, not just real estate. And what that historical series will tell you is actually that this 6-to-1 number has been around with us since the 1950s, actually. So a full, generation plus earlier. And surprisingly, the biggest drop in the racial wealth gap was in the first few decades after emancipation. So it fell from, on the eve of the Civil War, from 60-to-1, so Black Americans holding just 2 cents for every dollar of white wealth, to around 20-to-1, or 5 cents on the dollar after the Civil War. And then, gradually kind of hit that 7-to-1 or 6-to-1 number by the mid-20th century. So what that looks like is this kind of hockey stick shape of convergence, where we sort of stagnated now. We're kind of in some kind of steady state. And that, big drop after emancipation, can be attributed to Black Americans accumulating wealth for the first time. Since before the Civil War, 90% of Black Americans were enslaved as property themselves. They were legally barred from accumulating property. So why are we in this kind of hockey stick pattern of convergence? There's two reasons for that. The first is this shadow of this enormous difference in wealth from before slavery and around the time of the Civil War. And the second is that even after emancipation, Black and white Americans have faced what I would argue are different opportunities for wealth accumulation. So Black Americans have experienced lower savings rates as well as lower capital gains rates over this full post-emancipation period. Differences in savings rates can be attributed to demographic indicators that are known to push down savings rates. So differences in income, differences in wealth. And the differences in capital gains between the two groups can come back to the fact that Black Americans are much less likely to hold stock equity. And so Black households have been less exposed to just the astronomical rise in stock prices starting in the 1980s. But I want to kind of emphasize as I wrap up that even if we were to, say, equalize these differences in wealth accumulating opportunities, so equal savings rates, equal capital gains rates going forward, we're still hundreds of years away from convergence, away from closing the racial wealth gap. And that, again, is due to this just enormous original gap in wealth. And I think what that pushes us to think about when we think about policies for racial wealth equity are much bolder policies. So people have talked about reparations as a means for addressing racial wealth inequality. And it really is something more on that order of magnitude that's going to help address the initial gap that we're still living with today. And just to kind of put some numbers on things, when you mentioned 70 trillion in equity markets, closing the racial wealth gap would be about 10 trillion today. So it feels like, that's 3 infrastructure plans. It's not so crazy now that we're talking about trillions of dollars as easily as we do. So I just want to put that idea out there and move on to the conversation. Thanks.
Just about 70% of what Larry Fink manages at BlackRock. There you go. Sasha.
Great, well, I have the pleasure of going third, so I hope I can pick up on some of the things that were said by Wojciech and Ellora. One of the reasons that I think we should care about wealth inequality especially is because of the way it's passed across generations. So, of course, social scientists have studied this intergenerational stickiness in positions for decades. It's not new, right? We know that education tends to be similar between parents and kids, income, occupation, and so on. But what stands out about wealth is it can be literally the same dollars in your parents' bank account that then goes into your bank account, right? So those inheritances are not the only reason, of course, that wealth tends to be similar between parents and kids. We know there are these indirect processes too, but it really stands out from all the others. You cannot literally give your college degree to your kids, but you can give them an inheritance. The role of inheritance, of course, is especially pronounced at the top, right? So it's not so important for more middle-class Americans. And I think the previous panel had this sort of nice debate about whether we should care more about the top or care more about the rest of the distribution. And whether you put the emphasis on one or the other might shape how much you think we should be talking specifically about inheritances. But I think it wouldn't actually change how much you think we should be thinking about this intergenerational reproduction. So when we say that parents' wealth position is associated with their kids' wealth position, it's not just at the top. It's much better to be born to parents in the middle of the wealth distribution than to be born to parents at the bottom in terms of the wealth position you're likely to achieve. So that stickiness of wealth positions across generations, of course, has implications for equality of opportunity and lots of other things, and especially implications, as Ellora was saying, for the racial disparities that we see in wealth today. There are some people today who will say, all that was a long time ago, Ellora. I don't think we should care about that anymore. But this intergenerational stickiness reminds us that even the policies and the practices that were generations ago are still with us today. We still carry that legacy across generations. So in research with Brielle Bryan, who's an assistant professor at Rice University, we looked at the opportunities and the accumulation patterns of wealth for Black Americans, white Americans, and Hispanic Americans. And we tried to understand the sources of their different rates of accumulation from about their mid-20s up through their 40s. And we found you could explain about half of the advantage that white Americans held simply by those unequal starting points. So simply by differences in their parents' education and income and so on. So that reminds us that we can't just say, oh, the past is the past, we don't need to do anything to address it. The other half, of course, of racial inequality, wealth accumulation, is stuff that can't be explained by the economic resources of your parents. Instead, it's the inequality that we create fresh in every generation. So we find that, and this is of course not new to us, that even when you look at Black and white adults who grew up with similar levels of parental resources, their outcomes in terms of their wealth don't tend to be the same. And in particular, disparities in education, disparities in income, differences in home ownership, and differences in how much wealth you get when you become a homeowner, those things can really explain that fresh generation of inequality. So I think the lesson from this is essentially twofold. The past matters, but also it's not just about the past. So even with the kind of massive reparations plan that Ellora might be suggesting, that's not the end, right? If we just let things go on as they are, we will start to recreate inequality from day one after we implement those reparations. So those are the two things that I take away from that. And I'll just close by saying another reason I think it's really important to look at wealth inequality particularly, even though it's an imperfect measure for all the reasons Wojciech said, is it's also a place where I think inequality by race, but also in other dimensions, is really calcified, it really crystallizes together. So the inequality that we see in housing markets, in labor markets, in the criminal justice system, in education, those things all tend to point together to produce these inequalities in wealth. So rather than taking all those social institutions kind of one at a time, I think it's a place where we can see their cumulative effect. Thanks.
Thank you, Sasha, of course, Ellora and Wojciech. And I love this because we're actually having a conversation about the economics. I'm not putting aside, and Deron just walked, oh, there's Deron. We'll get to the authoritarian panel in about 45 minutes and why wealth matters for political economy. But this is answering the question of the student. I think it was a student who talked about Econ 101, why it matters, each of you. I was just kind of curious, and Wojciech, because you raised it, and my first question for you. So when you think about inequality, this conference is about wealth, but I sense that you're saying, let's not leave out wage or income inequality. Now, do you rank order them, or can you, if you say they're 100% of one interconnected thing, but which one would you put as more important?
I mean, descriptively, obviously, I mean, like these are different pieces of the puzzle, and you want to know something about them, like each of them. If I'm thinking about like broadly describing inequality within the society, some measure of, let's call it permanent income or something like this, except maybe for the very top. I think is probably the type of thing that I would be, if I had to pick one, I would pick that one.
For the middle, and
for
maybe in the upper
99%.
middle, for 90+% of the population, you'd say it's more about income. The uber rich, it's about the wealth.
Well, especially because measuring income at the very top becomes complex too. And what is income at the very top? Like, you think about appreciation, you think about people who have a lot of debt. So, like there are a lot of like various other things that to consider. So thinking about income at the very top, like you can do that, but it's not straightforward to measure that. So wealth becomes kind of an interesting, visible, relatively easy to measure, especially in the US, metric for that.
And Ellora, I'm wondering, you had that ratio of 1 to 7 or 1 to 6, that's on the wealth side. The income is no longer 6 times. It's separated, but it's not. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. do you rank order which is more dominant and more relevant in your field?
Well, I think they capture different things. And so the income gap is more like on the order of 67 cents on the dollar.
6 or 7%.
67 cents on the dollar.
67 cents.
Yeah, yeah. I like the way Sasha put it, that the wealth inequality gives us sort of a summary measure. One of the things Wojciech talked about is that wealth is trying to capture what you're going to consume over your lifetime, but I actually think wealth differences also tell us about the history, right? Because wealth is passed down generation to generation. So we get this kind of summary measure of the extent of inequality between Black and white Americans when we look at this average wealth measure, even if, of course, that's not describing the distribution, and wealth is very unequally distributed in both populations, among Black Americans and white Americans. But, as a sense of, what does this kind of population historically, multi-generationally have access to, especially given that networks are so segregated as well, that wealth gap measure really kind of tells us. Now, in the context of something like reparations, I don't design policy, but one could talk about how would you design that so that it's robust to sort of opening up gaps immediately after, but perhaps even more importantly, how it's distributed across the population, or where is the redistribution within Black Americans, for example.
And Sasha, you're a sociologist, you study these things. I grew up around the Wall Street, that which Liz and Oren were bashing earlier a little bit. So I didn't take it personally, though. But I recall, and I'm looking for your advice here, but I recall I'm in the Clinton administration. It's the late 1990s, and there's a surplus. The U.S. government, I know it's hard to believe, was running a surplus, and it was sort of like what to do with that. There was whether tax reform, and one thing people were looking at about is raising the limit that you could leave intergenerationally, the estate tax limit, which, believe it or not, was $625,000 then. Now it's $15 million per person, or $30 million a couple. But it was $625,000. And the Clinton White House was thinking, we could support maybe going up a little bit from that number or not. And there was a check with the Congressional Black Caucus. These are the members of the House of Representatives and the Senate. And they were all for raising the limit, which at first struck some of us as, that's interesting. We didn't, that it was broad-based, that people wanted that limit. What does that tell us about,
Well, I'm certainly not an expert on that, but I do think that...
and those were low numbers at
sure.
625,000.
As Ellora said, the racial disparities in wealth are extraordinary. They're extreme. But there is a group of middle-class Black Americans. And of course, to take away the opportunity to pass on your advantage to your children at a moment where we have maybe some of the first decades of Black Americans who have that opportunity, you can imagine that doesn't feel quite right either. So for example, you may have seen an article in the New York Times as colleges were wrestling with whether to allow legacy admissions. Right, and to say we have some of the first Black graduates of the University of Virginia, for example, or that's not right, not the first, but a larger share of Black graduates stopping legacy admissions right at the moment that it might have also benefited larger numbers of Black Americans, maybe doesn't feel like quite the right thing.
And we're talking on this panel more about the whole curve, and the earlier panel was talking about the tippy top of the wealth curve. Which do you think matters more to the economy? We'll let Deron talk about political economy later, But to the economy, is it?
That's for me?
Yeah.
Shoot. So I think they both matter in just in very different ways, right? I know that's sort of an easy answer, but of course, in terms of political capture and the kinds of control that the previous panel was talking about, the top end matters enormously. For the day-to-day experiences of ordinary Americans, the more relevant question is, are you at the 20th percentile, or are you at the 50th percentile, or are you at the 70th percentile? And I think as Oren was saying, those are quite different experiences in the United States. So that is not to say that people's ordinary lives aren't also affected by the political regime they live in and so forth, but I'm not gonna pick between the two of them.
So you're saying they both matter?
Absolutely, yeah, of course.
Laura, you have a view on this?
And so, setting aside the political question about the top.
Or you can put them both. You can pick and choose.
I mean, I think I'll choose a boring route here, which is when we're talking about racial wealth inequality and the average, that those dynamics really are driven by the top of the white distribution. So, stock equity holding is very concentrated in the white population as well, and this fact that the capital gains rate differences have been magnifying over the years, over the last several decades, that has to do with the runaway top of the white distribution. But then if we turn our attention to the median, I don't know, what do people think? Is it bigger or smaller, the racial wealth gap at the median? Bigger? Let's see hands. Smaller? It's actually bigger. It's 10-1. So I get this comment a lot, like, oh, well, surely if you move further down in the distribution, you'll see more equality there, and the answer is no. And that comes back to the fact that the median Black household doesn't own their home, and that's the main form of wealth holding for most Americans. So I guess, I'm going to come back to the same point that Sasha landed at, which is that they both matter.
You want to raise any points not raised, or do you want to go to the next question?
I think what I would want to kind of stress here, obviously, various aspects of the distribution matter, but the US is a rich country with a very rich upper middle class, and I think that matters a lot. If you think about wealth inequality, there is a bit contentious literature on measuring that. What's not contentious is that top 10% has a lot of wealth and that has grown. How it's split within the top 10%, there is more controversy there. But it has a very, very, very rich upper middle class, and I think that matters for a lot of different things.
Yeah, and I would say this, just an observation. I think it affects the political economy, and the political economy, the de facto political power that it expresses, then affects the economy. So it's it washes. I don't think you can just separate economics 101 from the political economy side, because the de facto political power in every congressional district in the US or every various district in Europe, but I'll stay in the US, affects who gets elected to represent that district as well. And what you study in taxes, it clearly affected the outcome of whether pass-through taxes and pass-through, these are very technical entities, but in every congressional district, there was some political economy about tax law. In every congressional district that's represented on the House Ways and Means Committee, which is probably the most important thing, there are some wealthy individuals in that district that are affecting that member of Congress's perspective, because they're in that community of 700,000 people.
Certainly, no doubt that there is an impact of these distributional issues on politics and inability to raise taxes at the top of the distribution, but it's not only at the top of the distribution. The US is a low-tax country. The US collects much less revenue than countries in Europe. Or other developed countries. And when you start looking at where these differences are, why, what accounts for collecting less taxes, it's not really taxation of the rich, or maybe that's a component. It's taxation of the middle class. The US doesn't have value-added taxes. US income tax is very progressive, maybe with the exception of capital gains. Like European income taxes started, high tax rates started much lower relative to the median, let's say, levels of income than they start in the US. So the US is a rich country because it's undertaxing broadly.
Except for tariffs. Tariffs are taxing everyone.
Well, so now, okay. The only hope for tariffs is that they lead to VAT down the line. That is the first step.
Before we have the audience participate with some questions, which we should do, I can't help but ask is technology. You've each studied it in a different way, and I'm not just talking about AI in the future, but how does technology fit in to each of your perspectives on inequality? And if I can start with Ellora, because you've done a long history from the 1860s to now, and we've had the railroad, we've had electrification, we've had all the way to the AI. These big waves of technological change, do they factor in, or it may not be a part of your research? But I'm only asking because we're in this world where we're all debating AI and what that will do, and kind of curious. You're the economic historian here.
My work doesn't focus on technological innovation per se, but I think the critical question there is sort of who benefits or who loses from technological change. And that brings us kind of back to distributional questions. When, for example, manufacturing declined in the 70s and 80s, there was a kind of phenomenon of last in, first out. So the impacts on jobs for Black workers were much starker than for white workers. I also think that with some technological innovations that can be complementary to workers with a lot of education or who are at the upper part of the wage distribution, that's going to potentially widen gaps between Black and white workers, again, just by making the returns to that extra year of education or whatever that gap is, even larger. And that kind of comes back to differences in returns based on these characteristics. So the reason the wealth gap is reopening and perpetuating is that Black Americans don't see the same returns on the same characteristics as white Americans do. So anything that widens those gaps in returns is going to come back to the wealth gap.
So if you had to think out AIs, you're not thinking AI is going to narrow that gap?
There was kind of this boom in encouraging racial minorities to invest in crypto. That's a cheap shot, but it ended up being somewhat exploitative because people kind of got in right before the bottom fell out of that market, and it evoked similar episodes in the past, encouraging sort of speculative investment in disadvantaged communities. So on that side, I don't feel super optimistic, but we do need to think about ways that AI is created by society and how can we shape the evolution of that technology so that it's more equitably beneficial. And I think we can be optimistic about that.
You're allowed to shot on goal if it's accurate. It's real. It wasn't cheap what you just said. It was real. Okay. Sasha, any thought about?
Yeah, as a sociologist in the room with the people who sort of invented the skill bias technological change literature, I'm very nervous to say anything about it, but I do think that literature is helpful here, right? While I think that wealth is a distinct dimension of economic inequality, I don't think it is unrelated to income inequality. So I think everything we've learned, which Ellora I think was also alluding to about how these changes in technology in the workplace shape income inequality, I anticipate that there'll be knock-on effects there as well. The next thing I'm going to say, I think, is not at all the most important implication for inequality of AI, but it's something that I've been thinking about, which maybe in our own venue of academia, one thing that generative AI is pretty good at is writing sort of template emails, right? And so one thing that students report using it for is helping them craft an appropriate appropriate email to a professor asking for an extension on an assignment. I think that's great. right? Certain people have the cultural capital to know what an appropriate email to a professor looks like. They know that I'll be irritated if they call me Mrs. Killewald and not Professor Killewald. They know these things, but not everybody knows those things. So again, I don't think this is the most important thing, but I have like one small sliver of hope that some of the things sociologists study a lot, this cultural capital, could become somewhat more equitably distributed in ways that actually matter for applying for jobs and so forth. Not the most important thing, just one thing.
Well, until AI reads those emails and it's no longer you.
But maybe that's also fine.
Yeah. I think technology has been very important in shaping inequality. I mean, there's literature on this. It's not the only thing that matters. You can imagine kind of alternative histories where institutions would be somewhat different and we would have similar technology and a little bit different outcomes in terms of inequality. But I don't think there is like any doubt that technological change and the types of people, things people do and skills they have, like premium to those skills, that these are sort of big components of inequality. If I think about, I'll make a plug for like one of my old papers. If I think about top wealth inequality, like what you said about technological waves, I think it's actually very important. So there have been periods when big fortunes were generated, and there were periods when they were not. And those periods seem to align with these kind of general purpose technologies that kind of spread out, that have a lot of different applications. One consequence of that is who are the rich. Nowadays, it's not that the inheritance is completely irrelevant there, but most of the people on the Forbes 400 list are people who have built their companies, or like they are first generation wealthy, or at least first generation debt wealthy. And even 50 years ago, that wasn't true. If you look at the Forbes list when it started in the early 80s, inheritance was still there, and it was very present. And you have to go back to sort of 1930s to see kind of similar periods, and you have to go back to periods when cars and electrification and like all of these things were actually dominant and present.
I'm inviting folks up to the microphones, but for audience questions, but as you come up, I will say that I asked AI, I will say this was Gemini, Google, for a fun fact on each of our panelists, because I thought I wanted to introduce them with fun facts. I'm not sure any of these fun facts are right. I think they're all wrong. Wojciech, you were a closet terrific photographer, it said, and I should point that out. Wrong, right?
That is wrong.
This is wrong.
That is definitely wrong.
Yeah. Ellora, it said that I should point out that you were a theatrical lighting designer when you were an undergraduate.
And I avoid stages.
I checked. I asked whether I could say
that's
these.
That's also 100% wrong.
Sasha, I didn't tell you what it told me to say, but that you're a long-distance runner.
Nope.
Fun facts, Gemini, just saying, not to be used to find fun facts, just for a little fun. Isn't anybody going to ask? Here we go.
Hello, thank you so much for the panel. It was very informative. My name is Jesus, I'm a PhD student. And basically what I'm thinking is, it seems to me that a lot of equalizing efforts in America are opposed by many citizens, and that opposition is driven by anti-racial sentiments. So my question for the panel is, to what extent can we address wealth inequality in America for all Americans without meaningfully addressing basically the role that anti-racial sentiments play in a lot of opposition to that?
Okay, yeah, I got you. That's a tough question. Well, I guess there's two things I want to say. One is that I don't know if this is so much true about wealth inequality, but in terms of income inequality, there are a lot of policies that are universal that can be very powerful for addressing income gaps. One of the ones that I've studied is the minimum wage. That is consistently extremely popular among Americans in red states, blue states, historically, and right now we basically have a kind of legislative hurdle that can't be overcome, let's put it that way, to raise the federal minimum wage. But in the times that we've done that historically in the U.S., it's been very beneficial for everyone and made big changes in terms of income differences, which can then have knock-on effects on wealth. For wealth inequality and this kind of elephant in the room about reparations, I guess what I would want to say is, we have had these big episodes of sea changes in institutions around race, whether that's the Civil War, but also the Civil Rights era. And I think it's possible to form these coalitions and move to a different equilibrium. I'm unfortunately not able to give much more detail, on that, but I think we have to live with that hope because it's happened before.
Do you want to?
Hi, my name is Lucy Massal. I'm a postdoc at the National Bureau of Economic Research. My postdoc is generously funded by the Stone Foundation. I wanted to return to a theme of the panel, which I saw to be about wealth as a proxy variable or a composite variable that we don't always perfectly understand, but one that we think has this outsized externality that we're concerned about. And given that you're all, measurement experts, I was wondering if you could comment on either the frontiers of or questions we're interested in that would connect, things that we might want to measure in order to understand the channels from that composite variable to that externality.
So your question is, what's the frontier of things we might want to measure that we currently aren't measuring?
How do we connect the measurement literature and the belief we all have about this externality? How do we learn more about that?
Why don't we go straight down the panel, Sasha, and down.
Yeah, I don't know if this is going to connect to the externality point, but I think in terms of measure, this is going to sound like an obvious answer, but I think it does matter to ask yourself, what is the mechanism you're interested in, and what are the implications of that for what I want to measure? So, Wojciech, when you said, there are these cross-national differences that make wealth kind of dodgy, I thought, yes. But maybe that's not as much of a concern if I'm interested in understanding who has more wealth and who has less within a country in an individual moment, right? So Americans are broadly subject to the same social security system and so on and so forth. I think that matters. The concern about medical residents, well, maybe don't look at wealth at age 28, right? So I think thinking through what do we care about and what does that mean for when we should be looking in the life course. Ellora, you mentioned per capita wealth, and I was struck by that because so often when we talk about disparities, we just look at household level differences. When are the times it makes more sense to do per capita? When do we want to do some sort of equivalency by the square root of family size or whatever it might be? When do we want to really think about the household? I think that's a good first step. So not measuring better, but conceptualizing better.
I think there are important episodes in history that can kind of shed light on this question. I'm thinking about the relationship between wealth and political power, for example. During Jim Crow, so after Reconstruction and Southern Redemption, so Democrats are back in power in the South. There's a ton of racial violence, and if you actually look at these episodes of racial violence, a lot of them involve targeting Black wealth, and then kind of subsequent effects on Black political participation. And I think that's actually an episode that's been understudied in economics, but it suggests that people were clued into this mechanism. Maybe it's just correlations that we just can't see linking wealth to political power, but I think digging into those kinds of historical episodes with the right data can actually shed some light on these questions that matter today as well.
So I kind of agree with everything that was said in the sense that conceptualizing what are we talking about is extremely important. And obviously, these political externalities are sort of the first thing that comes up in this context. So that's definitely, voting or electoral outcomes and lobbying and various things that relate to it. so the relationship of wealth concentration and these things, very hard to study, but obviously very interesting questions. But I guess I would add to it, I'm also interested in whether this is actionable in the sense that so there is a correlation with concentration and political outcomes. Would reducing wealth of richest people by 10% make a difference here? That's actually doesn't follow automatically from the existence of that correlation. And if it doesn't, then it sort of speaks to the types of instruments that you would want to use to address it. Like, is it really that you want to do something about wealth concentration, or is it that you need to reform institutions that lead to these outcomes?
And we're going to go over here, but I would say just from the political economy, one thing that I think would be helpful is, and it's back to Economics 101, any data about how wealth inequality actually lowers the growth in consumption. To make it somewhat a self-interested piece, but if you don't have a fair enough distribution of income and wealth, are you going to lower the growth? I know we're going to lower the growth through the political economy, but it doesn't sell that well. So there's something there.
Jim Peterba, I'm a colleague of Deron and David's, and Simon's here at MIT. And
he ran the economics department and ran NBER and all those things.
But I wanted to come in on Ellora's very interesting fact about the median versus the mean. And while we know that building great fortunes kind of requires getting ownership of a business enterprise and riding it up, for the median, I suspect that housing and home ownership is actually at least and maybe even more important. So my question to the group, and Gary, you should feel free to jump in on this, is when we've tried to push home ownership in the US, say the early part of the 21st century, we've often discovered that when you then get a downturn, that can be quite difficult. And I think the evidence suggests that the minority groups fared worse in the global financial crisis with foreclosures and losing houses. And in fact, if you run the tape backwards, it looks like it actually was a bad experience in many cases because their modest down payments were now exhausted by having had this unsuccess. So given that, and Ellora, I'm thinking that you and Wojciech have talked about the income as well as the wealth inequality aspects. Given that the income inequality is often associated with more volatility for the lower income groups and for some of the minority groups, do you have any ideas for how we might try to facilitate that on-ramp into the owner-occupation regime in a way that protects them from the downside? It's really an insurance problem. I'm looking over at Jim, trying to figure out how do you handle this. But there are many elements of this, and it does seem like for middle-class households, managing to up the rate of home ownership and get people to the point where they're building up that asset accumulation could be very important. But at least our structure does seem to have some real risks associated with it. So open on that.
So I can try to say something about this one. And maybe that's a little bit contrarian, but also it's European and New Yorker in me. So I live in an apartment building. I'm very happy with that. That eliminates a lot of risks that you are facing. It's not obvious to me that owning a house in the US is actually such a good financial decision. And because, there are a lot of expenses, there are a lot of risks, there are a lot of uncertainties related to it. For whatever reason, outside of New York and like a few other places in the US, the idea of living in an apartment building is not that popular. But that's, it is popular in many other places in the world. And it is a path to home ownership. It is kind of a safer path, or at least I would venture a guess that it's a safer path. There is something about the U.S. economy that premiums these things, and what that relates to, and actually kind of connects to what I said about upper middle class, is that so the system where you have extensive zoning and restrictions on building that protects value of existing housing. That's sort of a component of that story. That's what contributes to this accumulation through housing. And it is about owner-occupied housing, and it is about houses with big lots and these types of things. So I don't have an answer, but sort of to me it feels like there is an opportunity in that that sort of part of the problem.
And Jim, I'm being told, but he might be at time. I don't know if there was a question. No, all right. But I would just say I think that event, the 2008 event, was a debt-infused valuation bubble. Now, we might have our own valuation bubble now in AI, but that's not a housing thing. But I think we'd want to avoid that, but we have an affordability issue. And that goes to Wojciech's thing. Some of it's zoning, some of it's Americans' desire to have more square footage per home than they did 30 and 40 years ago. But there's a real affordability issue in housing that goes beyond this conference. So, but a big thank you to Ellora, to Wojciech, to Sasha. I'm sorry to find out that you're not the runners and the lighting directors and photographers, but you were great on inequality as an economic historian, a sociologist, a public finance and tax expert. So let's give it up.